Welcome participants. In this section we are going to talk about in detail India's foreign policy in the post-Cold War period, a period which started with early 1990s. In this section we are going to give more details about what actually shifted India's foreign policy in the post-Cold War period, what are those factors and how these factors have changed India's foreign relations and its status in international arena. Of late, there is an emphasis on India's position in international arena as an emerging power. It is often stated that India is an emerging power. In this context, we need to see the overall international system and how it has contributed to the shift in India's foreign policy. So let's look at the changing global balance of power since 1990s. This shift in global balance of power broadly came up because of the end of Cold War, end of political binaries at the global level, and there was also a change in the architecture of global power from unipolarity to multipolarity, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. There was unipolarity in the sense the US was dominating the international system to a much more dynamic world order in which different states began to dominate in their respective regions. In that sense, there is a sort of multipolarity in operation. And there was also a rapid expansion of globalization and subsequent marketization of economies of states from the global south. There was also a shift in world's economic center of gravity from Atlantic to Asia. And another important factor that contributed to the new global balance of power was increasing degree of regionalization and nuclearization of South Asian states, and so on and so forth. As far as India is concerned, there were certain key drivers for the shift in India's foreign policy, which primarily came from inside the country. There was a quest for strategic autonomy. There was aspiration to status transformation. There was a desire to play a role in shaping the global system. There was a need to access technology and bypass technology denial regimes. And there was also a sort of hunger for energy. To a large extent, India's growing economy need to be sustained with influx of energy from different parts of the world, and there was also certain kind of regional imperative, for instance its aspiration to play a continental role. Apart from these, there were other factors which might be minor in nature. For instance, its own concerns with its diaspora, promotion of democracy, geography, and its normative understanding of the global order, so on and so forth. When you look at the foreign policy in its entirety, as far as the shifts in the post-Cold War period are concerned, there are three sets of factors which have broadly contributed to the shaping of the foreign policy. The first set of factors, which were international or broadly systemic in nature, consisted of end of Cold War, end of bipolarity, rapid expansion of globalization, an unfolding model of market-driven capitalism. From the domestic setting, the factors were broadly came from its own experience with the planning processes which India had from the very beginning of independence till the 90s, in the sense that there was an impression that there was a not so desirable result from the planning process, and subsequently there was initiation of economic reforms, and there was a consensus on economic reforms among political parties, and nuclear weaponization from the domestic arena also came up as one of the domestic factors. Factor was personal, in the sense that the new leadership that came up in the post-90s, especially the leadership of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, also acted as individual level factors which contributed to the shaping of foreign policy and the building of an image for India as an emerging power. When you look at the major foreign policy premises of India in the post-90s, you can see broadly a few important trends. For instance, shift in the practice of non-alignment, multidirectional engagement of major powers, opening of new pathways, and a renewed dynamism in regional grouping. If you take the first point, shifts in the practice of non-alignment, there has been new forms of alliances which India has entered into this period in order to cope with the changing global realities. For instance, India's relations with the United States is a notable example. US to a large extent was outside India's foreign policy friendly ties associations in the Cold War period. That particular state became much more important in India's foreign policy calculus in the post-90s, precisely because of the dismantling of Cold War binaries and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Another important aspect that gives us an idea about the de-emphasis on non-alignment is India's nuclearization in 1998. The nuclearization has completely changed India's position on disarmament. For the first time, India claimed to the world that India is a de facto nuclear weapon state, and its status was recognized by some prominent states, and of course there were some controversies. So as I mentioned earlier, there was also a multi-directional engagement with major powers apart from United States. For instance, India's relationship with West Europe, India's relations with Japan, India's relationship with Southeast Asia have improved and have come to a level where it started providing new outcomes. Another important premise of India's foreign policy in the post-Cold War period was opening of new pathways. With the two important countries, India began to have relations like never before. One was India's relations with Israel, and the other one was India's relations with South Africa. With the Jewish state Israel, India had issues in the past because of its own understanding of the Jewish state, and also out of India's concern with the Palestine question in the region. India also had issues with South Africa, which was actually which was considered to be problematic in India's foreign policy calculation because of its policies on racial issues, and when South Africa came out of apartheid in the early part of 1990s, India began to have better relations with that country. Another important premise of India's foreign policy was renewed dynamism in regional grouping. An emphasis on multilateralism began to emerge in foreign policy. As a result of that, India started to building relations both at the regional level and also at the transcontinental level. The regional level groupings included the BIMSTEC, the Indian-Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation, Shanghai Cooperation, and so on. At the transnational level, India began to enter into alliances with like-minded countries by way of the BRICS grouping, IPSA grouping, and so on and so forth. If you look at the foreign policy emphasis in the recent times, one can see that there is a large-scale continuity than change. For instance, India continues to have better relations with countries such as US, European Union, Japan, and so on. It is also giving a lot of importance to economic diplomacy. In that sense, economic diplomacy assumes greater significance in India's foreign policy discourse in the last 3 decades. There's also minor modifications in India's foreign policy. For instance, the policy which India inaugurated in the early 90s to link with Southeast Asia called Look East was transformed into Act East policy in the recent times. Dear participants, let's conclude this lecture by reflecting on some of the points we have discussed so far. There are different approaches to understand Indian foreign policy. Those approaches broadly revolve around sovereignty, alliances, power distribution, conflict on political values, and domestic politics. We have also looked at the trajectory through which Indian foreign policy has traversed from the pre-independent days to the contemporary period. One can say that India has emerged as a major power in the global arena in the post-Cold War period. India, a country which followed idealistic orientation, in quote and unquote, in its foreign policy, turned pragmatic, quote and unquote, in the post-Cold War period. To a large extent, India redefined its policy of non-alignment and involved with major powers through multi-directional engagement while breaking new pathways. Economic aspect has begun to take center stage in India's external engagements in the contemporary period.